Hi everyone, welcome back to the garden. We're here in my North Lincolnshire tropical style jungle garden. Spring is very much here. Admittedly, not really today, but as I'm sure you're aware, here in the UK, spring is very much a frame of mind, isn't it? And here in my garden, a lot of the winter protection now, its days are limited, and a lot of the garden is really getting ready to grow. Spring is one of the most exciting times of the year, and in the past I've held off doing a video about spring jobs because I don't really like the description jobs. For me, what is one person's mindful task to do out in the garden on a beautiful day is another person's really overwhelming chore. So it's one of those things, but this is what I do here in my garden, or at least should do in my garden every spring to really improve my summer display. Put the effort in now, follow these tips in the video, and your summer garden will absolutely look better for it. So let's get started. Part of the reason why I also wanted to do a back to basics, no nonsense, helpful video was because of my last video, making this little wall here. Let's face it, that was a entertaining but shambolic display of how I'm going to contain my Gunnera. There was absolutely no practical advice in that whatsoever. But these Gunnera now, you can see they're very much starting to grow. Those leaves are pointed up at the sky and getting ready to erupt. My first point is all about feeding. As soon as the weather turns from winter to spring, feeding is definitely at the top of a lot of people's minds. But is it the right time to feed a lot of the plants in the garden? What can you do right now as we head into April? Some of the tips in this video will be exotic garden specific, but most of them will apply to any kind of garden. And when it comes to feeding, I've actually done two videos in the past. One, talking about when is the right time to feed your tropical style garden, and the other one, looking at a feed I specifically use here. I'll put links to those videos as well as the product in the description below. I use 6X, the Vitax feed. Let's just have a little spoiler alert there. And it's something that I use for most plants throughout my garden. But if there's two take-home points I want you to remember today, it's firstly, there's no point feeding a plant before it's ready to grow. And secondly, more doesn't always mean better. Whatever the style of plants that you grow in your garden then, let's face it, here in the UK, spring can be changeable at best. Very hard to predict exactly what the temperatures are going to do. And here in my exotic garden, a lot of the palms, like this Jubaea chilensis you see behind me, they're not really going to grow much before, well, we'll say before it gets to around 20 degrees during the days, which might be a little way off yet. So there's no point feeding plants before it's their time to grow. Well, simply you'll either waste it, it'll just wash into the soil and disappear while they can't even access and use it. If you chuck a lot of food at plants, even at the ones which are growing earlier, all they're going to do is send off a lot of really soft new growth, which, let's face it, if we do end up with quite a wet spring, the slugs are absolutely going to love. You're basically laying out a banquet for them. So my first tip is really feed your plants when it's the right time for that plant. Think about what you got in your garden and don't just indiscriminately chuck food all over your garden thinking it's the best thing for all your plants. So what do I do then in actual practical terms? Well, even here in my garden, where a lot of the plants are exotic, tropical style, there's a lot which are growing now. I've got roses, and those had a nice mulch of organic matter, well-rotted Phormiums here as it was. They had that done in winter. But there's a lot of shrubs, plants which grow early in the garden, which can benefit from some feed throughout the end of March into April time, no problem at all. And for that, I use bloodfish and bone. Again, I'll put a link in the description to the actual product that I use. A top tip for this would be buy large sacks from Amazon or eBay, wherever's cheapest. That is the most efficient way to buy them. Rather than paying a tenner for say 3 or 4 kilos, something like that, if you spend £25, you can get 25 kilos, which definitely goes a lot further, and simply spread it around. That's something that I think you can do from the end of March throughout April, no problem at all. But then when it comes to the bigger leaves, which are just starting to grow, I think I'd wait a little bit longer. For a lot of the real big leaves in my garden then, the hardy ones which do stay in the ground all year and start growing a little bit earlier than the genuinely tropical plants, the Gunnera, Ligularia, Rheum, there's a lot of big leaf plants which start growing probably throughout April. That's when they put on the majority of their growth, and that is a really good time to feed them. So for plants like this, which obviously need more nitrogen to produce those huge leaves, that explosive dramatic growth, I use the Vitax 6X feed. You can use chicken manure pellets instead. Any kind of well-rotted organic matter can work, but I personally like to give these plants a nice boost of high nitrogen feed as we enter April. Now, it doesn't matter really when you do this. Early April, if you live somewhere milder during a warmer spring, late April, May time, there's no pressure whenever you get the time to. But personally, this is one of the jobs which, unlike some I will be talking about very soon, I do actually enjoy. I like getting a bag of the 6X feed. I know it smells a little bit funky, but just get a scoop and spreading it around these big leaves, knowing that I'm setting them up for a season of absolutely gigantic growth. So April is a time when I apply high nitrogen food, but only to the big plants which grow fast throughout the year, not other slow growing plants like Trachycarpus and trees. And then next up, the third group of plants, the palms, the tropical style stuff that only really starts growing in May. So yes, you've probably guessed it, you clever people. There's no point feeding the Musa Basdew, which is currently wrapped up and won't be unwrapped until at some point in April. The Boutia palm over there, there's no point feeding them much before May. The banana will only just be starting to grow through April. There won't be the heat to get some real significant sustained growth out of it much before then. And the palm, like I mentioned, that won't be growing generally at least until around May time. So if you kind of remember at the back of your mind, there's three main phases of feeding. Number one is the general plant in your garden, blood, fish and bone, a nice scattering, that will set them up nicely, some slow release growth to feed them throughout the season. You then got the big leaves which start growing a little bit earlier, plants like Ligularia. If you grow vegetables off the early season crops, they can benefit from a nice high nitrogen feed to really get them on the way. And then the third group, the plants which really need the heat to get growing, I would definitely recommend waiting until around May time. Again, these aren't too specific. You could start early May, you could start early June. It won't make too much difference, but there's no point using expensive palm specific feed, for example, or pouring lots of nitrogen around your banana plants when there simply isn't the heat there, the sustained heat, the nighttime temperatures to really support that growth. So there we are in a nutshell. That is what I do to feed my garden in spring. Obviously, having a tropical style garden, most of my feeding is skewed through the summer months anyway. So for me personally, from May through to August is when most of the plants get most of the nutrients to put on all that amazing growth. And as I touched on, more isn't necessarily better. And if you're in any doubt, do follow the instructions. Yes, even you men, have a quick read of the package, see what it says, and roughly follow that. Here in my garden, I definitely get carried away trying to encourage some incredible exotic growth from my more tropical style plants. Looking at the Gunnera there, the more you give that, the bigger it gets. And the same goes for bananas, cannas, ensete, all those kind of plants. But for everything else in the garden, particularly established plants, the structural plants which you plant and leave that keep growing every single year, you don't want to overfeed these because that growth will just be soft and floppy, more vulnerable to being damaged by wind, frost, winter weather. You want these plants to grow steadily away by providing them the right nutrients at the right time of the year. There's definitely no benefit to chucking a load of feed and everything. Next tip then, watering. Yes, although it might be grey and windy here, a lot of the plants, as I'm filming this currently at least, are starting to dry out. In particular here, my tree ferns, these are a plant which require a decent level of humidity and moisture throughout the growing season. And actually, over the last couple of months, we haven't had a huge amount of rainfall. A quick shower going through your garden, especially on a windy day, does very little to actually water plants significantly. So if you grow a lot of plants which really require a moist spot in the garden, definitely go out and check them. Ferns might appreciate a bit of extra water at this time of year. Pots in particular, if you keep pots in your polytunnel or greenhouse, definitely now you need to be looking at them a little bit more regularly, keeping on top of that watering. They can soon dry out in a couple of days. And if you do grow tree ferns, now is the right time to give them a decent watering. Not every day, we're not at that stage yet, it's not peak midsummer heat, but definitely every few days, maybe every week, give them a proper drenching with a hose, even if it's rained that week, and they will absolutely appreciate it. We're not trying to fire these plants into growth prematurely, but you don't want to stress them. And hopefully, if you keep up the watering at this time of year, the fronds, when they do emerge, will be even bigger and better than last year. It's also not a bad time of year to set up soaker hoses like I've got here while your borders are quite empty and bare. Set those up now and you'll make your life a lot easier in summer. Not only do these hoses deliver the water to exactly where it's required, but you also use and waste less as well. So win-win, definitely. My next tip then is all about a good spring clean. Yes, now warmer weather is slowly, gradually stumbling towards us. It's time to start looking ahead, tidying up some plants, removing winter damage, removing old growth, and looking ahead to the warmer weather. These plants with a little bit of work will look so much better when that sun finally comes around. But it's not time to prune everything just yet. Here in my garden, the tree ferns, Dicksonia antartica, look an absolute mess. Let's face it, they're browned, they're horrible, they don't look great at all. And even with the ones where I am leaving some of the old fronds hanging down to create a brown skirt around the trunk, they definitely look a mess right now, don't they? I know as gardeners, we're always torn between keeping things neat and enjoying them looking their absolute best versus being a little bit more natural and doing what's best for the plants. But personally, I would say don't trim the old fronds off your tree ferns just yet. I'm not saying cutting them prematurely definitely hurts the plant. I know watering really is the absolute key for having a healthy tree fern. And I've seen lots of people who chop the fronds off even when they are green and still have healthy plants to show for it. But my honest advice based on my experiences here would be don't chop off green fronds. That applies whether you talk about ferns, trachycarpus, palms, anything like that. If it's green, it's doing good for the plant. I know some people say if you trim off more of the lower down leaves, the plant will be encouraged to grow taller. And I'm not sure quite how I feel about that. It's not a scientific experiment that I've looked into, but what I personally think is, while a frond or leaf is green, it's creating energy for the plant's going to grow faster, simple as. And when it comes to tree ferns, as I've talked about in the past, those fronds around the edge of the trunk, if you chop them off while they're green, they can sometimes lock in position, narrowing and restricting the crown. You need a good open crown to get a good crop of new croziers the following season. So what I do, and what I'd recommend you doing, is definitely you can chop them off, no problem at all, but I'd wait until the new croziers are just starting to open, which for me will be maybe around early to mid-May. At that point then you can give them a nice chop off, because when they're like this, they're already broken and smashed, they're already lightweight anyway, they're not actually opening up the crown due to their own weight, and if anything, the wind's more likely to blow these into new croziers and snap them off. So in all honesty, keep on top of the watering with your tree ferns, and if you want to tie them up, at least wait until around early to mid-May time when you can do it without actually negatively affecting the plant. But hopefully we can look forward to seeing some bigger and better, bright, vivid new croziers for yet another year. There's some plants in my garden, like the Fritillaria imperialis, a beautiful variegated form here, which are absolutely full of spring energy and vibrancy. Then there's other plants like this Phormium, which definitely don't look the best right now. A usually very, very tough, hardy, reliable plant. In fact, I feature them in my video looking at 5 must-have exotics for UK gardens. This one isn't looking great right now, so potentially not the right plant for a shadier spot. But at this time of year, it's a great opportunity to tidy them up. And simply, with something like this, just track back the old growth, which is easier said than done on a big plant, and simply remove it. Basically, all I do is take off anything that's brown, or like this leaf here, completely damaged anyway, chop them back, and that way you'll have less brown leaves in your summer display, and you can also let a little bit more airflow, light into the plant itself, and hopefully in around late spring, early summertime, you'll see some new leaves appearing, and your plant will once again look its absolute best in the summer. If you're one of the brave and intrepid gardeners who grow a lot of bamboo like me, it's not quite the time yet to actually produce this grove effect by removing the leaves and branches lower down. You're better off waiting until early summer for that, and I'll explain why nearer the time. But it's a great time to tidy up some other bamboo, remove dead growth, and in fact, I'll show you one now. One thing you will find if you grow lots of unusual bamboo, particularly here in our increasingly unpredictable climate, is that not every single culm that grows reaches maturity. And often a lot of the culms get aborted, I suppose, as they reach a certain height. They never fully develop. So at this time of year, you can always tell them by the colour. They never look the same vibrant colour as the rest. You can tell here this one's just brown, this one's dead, and also the noise that they make when you flick them, that doesn't sound alive, does it? So one thing you can do at this time of year, if you've got some big clumping bamboos like this, is just go through them, find this old growth, take it back to ground level, and just snip it off. And because it's not fully developed yet, these are nowhere near as tough and as hard as the actual culm, so it's a relatively easy job. I say easy because this is a big bamboo, but doesn't have many canes. But if you've got a clumping bamboo, which is a good few meters across, it's definitely gonna be a trickier job. But either way, it's a great time to get in there, chop off some of the old growth, and that way, once your plant starts to look even bigger and better as we approach summer, those new culms pushing through, brand new leaves, vibrant green colours, you'll be able to enjoy them so much more without seeing the brown behind them. Obviously, most deciduous shrubs, you can chop them throughout winter when they're not growing much, and you can pretty much get away with any amount of chopping and they usually grow back just fine. But when it comes to the slightly more tender exotic shrubs, such as here, Euphorbia John Phillips, which for me usually is a very tough and hardy evergreen, but unfortunately, maybe due to cutting it a little late last year, or maybe the unseasonably early cold start to winter, it's definitely not looking its best right now. But the reason I haven't chopped this before the end of March is because if you cut these plants back while there's a risk of actual cold happening, real sub-zero temperatures, prolonged cold, then that plant might actually be bitten by further frost and cut back even harder. So as we get into April, mid to late April maybe, for those of us here in the north, it's time to finally chop these plants back. This bit here, you can see there is still some green, so there's a good chance this will grow again and thrive. That growing point isn't lost, or it wasn't at least until I snapped it just then. We'll pretend that didn't happen. But when it comes to older dead bits like this bit here, it's a very good time to chop those in April. The plant is now full of that rising sap, rising energy, and it'll hopefully outgrow any of this damage before long at all. Yes, by May, June, July, this plant will look vibrant, leafy green again, and it really will be a stunning plant once again in my Mediterranean garden. When it comes to grasses, you don't need the secateurs, and often just a good combing of the grass. I've not chosen the best example here, but just combing them with your hand will remove a lot of the dead growth and simply collect it up. And like with all the prunings, clippings, choppings I've got today, none of this gets wasted. It all gets recycled around my bamboo as basically a living compost heap. And one last example to show you, Cordylines. Again, you don't need the secateurs. These are really easy to look after. And all you really need to do at this time of year is just remove this brown growth. You don't need to do it because it falls off anyway, but as you can see, it comes off nicely by hand. And just by removing some of these brown leaves, pulling them away like that, you can see more of the beautiful, vibrant green growth that makes these such an amazing structural plant here in the UK. They really bring that exotic feel. And again, you can use the old brown growth as a kind of homemade weed suppressant on the ground below them. And that is my next tip. It's all about the weeds. Weeding is absolutely my least favourite job in the garden. Some of you might find it to be a beautiful, mindful time outside, time spent just with yourself and the ground. As that bee hums around there looking for somewhere to live, it can be a beautiful experience to be outside. If you're one of those people, get in touch because I could do with your assistance. For me at least, weeding is not a fun job. But one thing I would say is attack it early. Attack it in April. Use a weekend when it's not raining or just after it's rained so the roots come out even easier, and attack the garden. Get the weeds out. If you can get on top of them earlier, it prevents it from being a really overwhelming and daunting task later in the summer. That is my absolute best advice. Not every plant that self-seeds is necessarily a weed. And lots of the time, you can have some free plants, very easy to grow, perfectly hardy, that provides a lot of benefits to pollinators and other garden and wildlife. You don't even have to do anything for them, just simply leave them to grow. So in my garden here, I've encouraged a lot of plants like the red valerian to spread around, and the foxgloves, I edit them a little bit. I take out the ones where I don't want them, but if they're growing somewhere where they're at least acceptable, I'll let them grow and do their thing. So there we go. Firstly, get on top of the weeds, stamp them out, eradicate them, remove them, obviously by hand where possible. And then as a second thing, leave the ones which can provide some benefit to your garden, whether for the wildlife or simply your own enjoyment. The final tip today, which seemed like a good idea before that wind got up, it's all about frost protection. Yes, a lot of you might know this, fleece, frost cloth, whatever you know it as. This is what you need to protect lots of your plants from those late and damaging frosts. Yes, as I mentioned before, there's plants here like Musabaju bananas. Those will be unwrapped soon. They can take a light frost, no problem at all. And again, the tree ferns, I'll be taking off all the wrapping other than protecting the very crown for the frosty nights when we have them. Yes, as we head into April, May, the start of June, we like to think real cold weather is definitely behind us. And yes, those ice days, the real prolonged cold, those shouldn't be a thing anymore. But we can still get damaging nighttime frosts. Damaging because we can still get sub-zero temperatures, and also because a lot of the plants are then in active growth. And it's that active growth which is tender and can often get nipped. So at this time of year, it's still way too early to start hardening off real tropical plants. If you grow maybe vegetables, plants like squashes, pumpkins, sweet corns, you won't dream about planting those out before the frosts are finished for your area. And again, those of you who grow tender bedding plants, I'd like to think those are either kept nicely inside in a windowsill or in a greenhouse where you use this to protect them from any frosty nights. So yes, actually harden off plants, that's something we'll talk about later in the season. That's definitely a late spring, early summer job. But as an early spring job, just keep an eye on those plants in your garden which you've already uncovered. It might be Musabaju bananas if you live in a colder area. It might be Gunneras like you saw me unwrap in my last episode. Those plants can push out tender new growth. Now, the upside is, whatever kind of temperatures we experience, these plants will bounce back from it. But if you want the biggest leaves possible, if you want the best head start on this summer season, then definitely protecting them. If you see clear skies and anything around zero, it's definitely going to be frosty. So it's well worth getting outside, being that person outside with a head torch and some fleece, cover them over and keep them looking their absolute best when summer comes around. So there we go then, 5 very simple little tasks that you can do in spring which absolutely benefit your summer garden. Feeding sets plants up for the year, particularly when you use slow release feeds like those that I'll mention in the description below. And then when it comes to watering, plants like tree ferns, containers, pots, if you want to set those plants up for strong and healthy long-term growth, get some watering in now and those plants will absolutely thank you for it. And when it comes to tidying plants up, just do what you can when you can do it. It isn't too time specific, but it's well worth doing these little jobs now in spring before you get all the summer growth in the way. And then of course the weeding, which yeah, is one that I'll eventually get around to at some point. But yes, the frost protection out of everything, I think is one of those key little jobs that definitely doesn't take a lot of time like most of these jobs, but is completely worth doing. You put all these together, put a little bit of effort in here and there, spend an odd hour out in your garden at the weekend, and it will honestly come together. Because when June comes around and everything's fed, watered, looking tidy, looking beautiful, there's no weeds to see. Yeah, it's definitely not my garden, but it seems like a beautiful dream indeed, and one that hopefully we can all enjoy very soon. So I hope you found this video helpful, and if you've got any spring gardening tips or tasks that really improve your summer display, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. So thanks as always for watching, I'll see you later, bye!